Yeah, it's nice having you around again for our series in LSW. And today we want to look at literary theory and criticism in relation to literature. By the way, that has been, for a number of people, a very troublesome terrain because if I should ask you what theories are as far as literature is concerned, your honest answer will be it's just a mesh of problematic ideas, almost always impenetrable. You wonder who forged all this. Does this ever matter? I mean, why deconstruction, post-structuralism, and so what? Well, what I'm going to say is that to a very great extent, there has never been any literature without theory and without criticism. In fact, we can go on and say that many forms of literary productions are in themselves forms of theorizing or critiquing certain kinds of assumptions. For instance, we've had a situation in our contemporary times where a writer is responding to an opinion through literature, well, creative literature, and we know that this is a form of criticism. Let me give you an example. If you are familiar with Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, you will know that it delves into the oral tradition, the pre-colonial tradition of the Igbo land in Nigeria, of the Igbo world, let's put it that way, Igbo culture in Nigeria. By the way, the Igbos are a people from the eastern part of Nigeria, the southeastern part of Nigeria. And just like every other culture, especially in times that you might call pre-literate, so to speak, they had their own communalistic, cosmological ways of dealing with society, dealing with phenomena, dealing with abstractions, philosophizing, and the like. Things Fall Apart is a response to colonialist depictions of Africa as a dark continent. And precisely, he was referring to the colonialist works of some writers like Joseph Conrad, and we can extend that to certain other writers like Rudyard Kipling, Sir Rider Haggard, who in dealing with Africa as a space actually constructed what a particular critic, Abdul-Jam Mohammed, calls the economy of Manichaean narratives. It's an economy that brings about worlds, puts them together, and juxtaposes them in unequal terms. And unequal terms that puts the designated dominant power as over the others that are dominated. So if you looked at some literatures like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, okay, and you look at write-ups like She and the Return of Ayesha, let's come closer home to those that have been reading travel narratives. If you go to Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, and you find the fact that the representations of the other worlds, that is, worlds that were not European, that were not known as European, were designated in such ways that you saw them almost like animals, like brutes, like highly uncivilized societies. In fact, you even wondered if they had anything like culture at all. So what Chinua Achebe and so many other writers coming from, well, we call them periphery. We're coming there later when we begin to deal with post-colonial discourse. Those colonized, you discover that writers from such spaces began to react to these literatures that were seen as colonialist, that brought down the humanities of the colonized people, represented their cultures as animistic, barbarian, and so on and so forth. These writers coming from these spaces began to react to these colonialist literatures. And in such forms of reaction, you might say that literature took the form of criticism because criticism simply means one, interrogating a particular viewpoint, setting a new criterion at looking at meaning concerning that space of knowledge, and then also producing new forms of knowledge that might revise these former ones that are being interrogated. That's just criticism. Criticism doesn't mean attack, doesn't mean you are tearing down, but it simply means something like evaluation, or taking a difference from an initial point of view, or actually even changing the narrative of that difference into a new way of looking at things. So in that situation, literatures have often proven to be critical, but they come in creative ways. So talk about theory too. We can say that literature had been always embedded in theory. For example, to theorize simply means to have a map of knowledge about something, to have an idea, a position, an ideology about a phenomenon, and therefore to create meanings around that position that we are seeing as that chosen ideology. So when we say we theorize, we are talking about, number one, giving a positional statement about something. Number two, building a narrative that is convincing along that line. Number three, also proposing a way by which this could lead other forms of knowledge. In other words, when you are theorizing, you are proposing a kind of knowledge. You are also giving a prescription around it, and the ultimate is to circulate it for acceptance. Now, theories in literature don't just come as mere academic, very, very deep university kind of thing people do that becomes, very, very turgid to penetrate. No, a theory is simply to imagine something in a particular direction and then to circulate it, to market it, and the like. So literature in its production comes with a particular view of something, maybe about a society, about a people, about commerce, about an ecology, and then brings it out in a creative form, in a linguistically enchanting, sophisticated form, which an audience can follow. So in writing, you must have heard things like, that work is very, very excellent. That work is very unbeatable, or that work is a canonical work. When you hear things like that, certain things went underground that are not written on that literature. Number one, to call something canonical is to understand the fact that the person that wrote that thing was in a very deep thought, was in a very deep mental scape, and was in an ideological positioning that warranted the possibility of producing that work of art in the first instance. For instance, in Chinua Achebe writing Things Fall Apart, you discover that he had a kind of aversion to the tendency for certain literatures coming from the West, which are technically called colonialist literature, to form opinions that often tend to barbarize, to make a demonization, to make an inferiorization of non-European spaces they are commenting on. And in so doing, Achebe takes the form of a theorist in producing Things Fall Apart, which tends to correct such notions, those colonialist notions, and then present the world, the culture, the epistemologies of the Igbo world in an acceptable human construct of society, which becomes very much an antagonism against, the former colonialist writings. So in that context, literature acts like a theory. It's an intertwined thing when we're talking about literature in relation to theory, in relation to criticism, and then by extension, we're mapping a whole big universe of what we call literary history. Let me come back to literature as an embedded phenomenon of criticism and theory. Now, in creating a work of art, even from singular authors, they have an opinion. There is something they want to say, and they mean to say it to gain respectable knowledge acceptance. And when they do that, they have literally formulated a theory of what they are planning to sell as the knowledge produced by that literature. Along that line, literature is integrally a theoretical production. If we go back to the times of the Greeks and go back to the times of the Arabs and come to Africa and other places like we mentioned in the first lecture, you will discover that somehow we were not really saying it, but we are also referring to this phenomenon of theorizing in terms of literature. For instance, we were talking about Orpheus, Homer, the pre-Platonic Greek writers or literary producers, in the last lecture. Research will tell you that Homer often tried to educate his listeners, his audience, that if you want to be a respectable poet, you've got to find a way to sophisticate your language base, a way to make sure that you choose the right language. We can hazard and say that somehow that was one of the beginnings of formalism as we know it today, because formalism entails the fact that literature is basically linguistic, it's basically an entertainment venture, it's basically rhetorical, and therefore it's by nature not like the language of the street. Therefore, if you are going to write such a language for the consumption of audiences, you have got to be very, very technical. You have got to be very, very careful. You have got to be very, very selective. And then you come out in a very, very powerful way. That was an embedded theory that Homer was formulating. And also in checking out what was written, what was produced in Homer's time. Yeah, definitely what was written, because Iliad was a literary production that became much associated with writing and was produced for world circulation in its written form. You discover that the critics around that time, when you brought out what you called a poetic production, would normally have a perspective of what poetry should be like. They will always bring out what was faulty with your rhyme scheme, with your iambic constructs, with the way you set out elements like, rhythm, you set out elements like beats, cadence, tone, and all that. They will tell you that all these things had certain kinds of value expectations that a normal person that understood literature in their time would be looking out for. Whether they were in the university or they were in the village, they were critics of literature. So the naturalness, so to speak, of theory and literature had always been. There is the tendency for somebody to interject somebody that was considered as a start-up and was considered as just trying to do something original but needs to be guided to do it right. That was just criticism. This kind of thing continued and began to get sophisticated with time and with, more space beyond the original community, to the point that in modern times, you discover that it has taken a particular tone, a particular dimension that becomes very, very serious, very, very scholarly, and very, very engaging for the participants to be involved in. So, having said that, theories and criticisms as far as literature is concerned are very, very normal. They are not abnormal. So if you find somebody saying, no, I just like reading the literature, I just like enjoying the story, I'm not interested in theory. Or you find somebody that writes to comment on a particular form of literature or a particular novel or drama or poetry, and the person says, no, I'm not interested in theory, I just write normally. The point is the fact that you are commenting on that literature and the fact that you have a particular idea you are trying to shape into what you are trying to produce has brought you into the very thing you are rejecting. You are a theorist and you are a critic. But now, what we are bringing out for us to understand is that today, literature, theory, and criticism are so embedded that we've got to recognize certain ideas that play up within the scheme of work of the society, professions, cultures, gender, as a politics, and so many other factors that bring these things around. So when we talk about literary theory and criticism today, we are actually engaging in a situation that does not necessarily have to be derived from what we call literature, as to say this is literary theory, assuming that these theories are just for literature or they were brought out from reading literature. Like some people will say theories about literature or criticisms about literature. In contemporary times, especially right from the 1960s, when readings of cultural productions began to be expanded into several epistemic variants that reflected the true societies that were developing that had a number of different elements within them, literary theory began to take a shape that became so iconoclastic that it seems that they just keep coming out as continuous productions for and against one another, bringing out, elements that this one had said before, merging it into its own new forms, bringing that in, merging it in, breaking it up, reformulating it, engaging it, and getting out of it to produce something more. And then also, we will discover that right from the moment I'm talking about, that is, right from the 1960s, just some years after the Second World War, it seemed the world began to change in a new dimension, that there was a tendency to rupture things, to question givens, to formulate new ways of running society, knowledge, culture, relationships, and running the whole field of literature itself. Literature became more or less expanded to other cultural and social phenomenon just around, and it began to respond even more elaborately to international dynamics of power relations. Right from that period, we began to find out that there was a rupture even in the definition of modern literature. Modern literature began to get ruptured. The moments where prose fiction, poetry, drama, as we know it today, but is really changing today, was right from this very cataclysmic moments where people were looking at things from post-structuralist point of view. People were engaging literature from race theory perspectives. People were engaging literature from angles that border around gender politics, sexuality, and the like. You discover that literature began to open itself to ecology, to more penetrations from the world of technology, and also from the ecosystem. So literature became something that became dynamic and became, to a very great extent, revised into new modes of production, new oral modes, most especially generated through technological, popular cultural forms, okay? Just like we talked about last class, the production of slam poetry, for example. In recent times, when you go online, you are seeing literature in digital cartoons, you are seeing literature in blogs, you are seeing literature in exchanges on Facebook, and people will tell you, these are new exchanges that we can read with literary theory. And then you go beyond that. You'll be surprised that what you wrap up as emetic autobiography, biographies, histories, and all that, so far they have the kind of textuality that theory can engage in, and read this as a form of storyline. You discover that the same theories that engage literature are very much applicable to these very forms. And why is that so? It's because in current moments, theory itself has become something that comes from everywhere. In currency, we don't really talk about literary theory anymore. What we call theory that has to do with literature is just something that orbits within the expanded field of theory, coming from the social sciences, from the natural sciences, from technology, and so on, because it is like bringing literature within the landscape of humanity and social relations that go beyond just a fixity of looking at it as a necessary, imaginative, creative material that you have been looking for. But you are now seeing it as an engagement that is creating what a school of criticism sees as new historicism, that literature itself might be performing something better than what the historian is writing in its historical form, exposing the silenced voices in formal history writing and bringing things out that we can read basically as information that is more useful than history itself as a disciplinary production. And also, you discover that these theories come from economics, they come from the social sciences, from botany, from technology, and the like, and it makes it a more robust field. So what even makes it very interesting is that a number of these theorists were in themselves not trained in anything that relates to literature at all. For instance, you discover that in psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud came from a field that was basically in the sciences, medical sciences. It came from psychiatry. There are people that were absolutely within the field of linguistics. For example, Ferdinand de Saussure's structuralism began from the field of linguistics. We have some other fields, definitely. For example, if you are doing eco-criticism of literature, definitely that theory didn't emerge from literature. It came from fields that had to do with the environment. And a number of such things are very, very valuable for us in reading literature. So when we talk about literature today and we are talking about theory in relation to it or criticism in relation to it, nowadays we don't have a very neat way of naming it. For instance, what you call literary theory can as much be called cultural theory, and then there are other people that we name what they are writing about as critical theory, meaning that they are actually bringing in the perspectives of criticism and theory from every field right into their readings of that literary or cultural production. And then you discover that there is this engagement in which the theory you are using for literature is just as much as relevant to read similar textual phenomena that might be occurring in fields like, let's say, religion. For example, you can apply feminist reading on, people have applied feminist reading on the Bible, for example, on the Quran. They have applied a kind of reading of masculinity. In looking at William Shakespeare's The Tempest, people have brought in perspectives that are really into anthropology or coming from the field of Marxism or coming even from the field of modernism, trying to allege that it is just one of the ways in which modernism, as typified by how Prospero tended to expand his influence into the island that belonged to Caliban and Sycorax, how he was trying to extend a modernist phenomenon coming from Europe into that world, and thereby disciplining that place from the perspective of his cultural view of progress. Okay, so it is a very dynamic field where we bring in perspectives from several fields to read literature and other forms of cultural productions. So, ladies and gentlemen, this lecture will continue to expand these views the more and then begin to take up particular theories and do a reading of individual texts to give us a holistic view of what we are saying. For instance, in this series of lectures, we are going to take particular texts and apply the theories we have been looking at, or a theory we feel will be best suited for it, for our understanding, so that if you and I were to able to get the nitty-gritties of doing literary theorizing and criticism, we will be able to understand that literature today in this bigger space of cultural studies is a very interesting pathway of looking at the world in a new perspective, from a new lens, and also understand humanity, subjectivity, and relationships in very dynamic terms. Thank you very much. Yeah, in this lecture, we have tried to look at how literature, theory, and criticism interpenetrate and how this constitute a big field that makes the whole process of imaginative production, a very important enterprise in contemporary society, in fact, which had been very important in all societies. So we are going to go beyond this and extend these theories and criticism into other cultural productions like dance, songs, carnivals, films, and a number of popular cultural things that we find coming from youths, from particular sexes, from particular areas, that will be of interest to us. Thank you very much for this. Please don't forget to subscribe for these lectures, and please remember to drop your questions. Let's hear you out. Let's have a dialogue, and we are good to go. Thank you very much.